The Road to Serfdom, Chapter 1, The Abandoned Road. How Emergency Planning Replaced the Moral Confidence of Liberal Society. Chapter 1 argues that Western societies did not drift towards coercion by accident, but consciously abandoned liberal restraint in favor of centralized planning, believing it more rational, more modern, and more humane. Hayek begins the road to serfdom not with economics, but with a historical observation that many readers find uncomfortable. The loss of freedom in modern societies did not begin with tyrants or revolutions. It began with good intentions, shared by educated, moral, and well-meaning people who believed the old liberal order was no longer sufficient for the problems of the modern world. The road Hayek refers to is classical liberalism, not libertarianism in the modern characterized sense, but a social order built on limits on state power, limits on centralized authority, and limits on what any one group could impose on the whole of society. This tradition did not promise perfection, it promised restraint. What was abandoned, Hayek argues, was not compassion, but humility. The recognition that no authority could fully know how society should be organized without coercing those who disagreed. By the early 20th century, that humility was gone. The moral confidence of the planner. Hayek opens by noting a widespread belief that freedom had become obsolete. Liberal society, critics claimed, was too slow, too chaotic, too unequal to meet the demands of industrial modernity. Markets were messy, democracy was indecisive, tradition was inefficient, planning by contrast appeared scientific. This was not a fringe belief, it was held by intellectuals, reformers, bureaucrats, and many democratic leaders. Central planning promised coordination instead of competition, foresight instead of uncertainty, and justice instead of chance. It appeared not authoritarian, but enlightened. Hayek's crucial point is that this shift was moral before it was political. Planning was embraced because it felt responsible. It allowed leaders to say they were doing something, directing outcomes rather than tolerating imperfection. Freedom, by comparison, came to look passive. From limits to outcomes. The older liberal tradition focused on rules, general laws applied equally, within which individuals made their own choices. The new planning mentality focused on outcomes, specific social goals that had to be achieved, employment levels, production targets, equality measures, national strength. The shift is subtle but decisive. When the goal becomes a specific outcome rather than a general rule, discretion must replace law. Somebody must decide which goal matters most, which groups must sacrifice, which freedoms are negotiable. Planning requires not just authority, but priority setting, and priorities cannot be neutral. Hayek is not arguing that planning is evil. He is arguing that planning cannot remain democratic once disagreements arise, because disagreement itself becomes an obstacle to the plan. Why the road was abandoned. The title, The Abandoned Road, is deliberate. Hayek is not claiming society was pushed or tricked. He is saying the road of liberal restraint was chosen to be left behind. Why? Because liberalism accepted uncertainty. It tolerated inequality. It allowed outcomes that offended moral sensibilities. And during periods of crisis, especially economic depression and war, those traits became politically intolerable. Emergency conditions demand action. Planning thrives on emergency. Once people become accustomed to centralized direction during crisis, Hayek warns, it becomes psychologically and institutionally difficult to return to restraint afterward. The tools remain, the habit persists, the justifications evolve. What was once temporary becomes normal, like taxation these days. Freedom as an obstacle. One of Hayek's most unsettling observations is that freedom itself begins to be seen as the problem. If society has a plan, then individuals who do not align with it are not merely different, they are disruptive. Dissident becomes inefficiency. Independence becomes irresponsibility. Choice becomes waste. At that point, coercion does not arrive as tyranny, it arrives as necessity. Hayek is careful here. He does not claim planners desire oppression. He claims they will justify it, because once a plan exists, failure to enforce it looks like negligence. Why this chapter matters for the whole book. Chapter 1 is not yet about dictatorship. It is about the moral preconditions for coercion. Hayek wants the reader to understand something foundational. The greatest threat to freedom is not hatred of liberty, but the belief that liberty must be sacrificed for higher ends. Once society accepts that premise, the remaining chapters are not warnings of what might happen, but explanations of what must happen. Connection to the 20th century and beyond. Although Hayek is writing during World War II, his argument reaches beyond fascism or socialism as labels. He is describing a pattern. Crises justifies planning. Planning requires authority. Authority requires obedience. Obedience reshapes society. War accelerates this process, but does not create it. This is why Hayek's opening chapter pairs so naturally with later thinkers like Orwell, and with the historical patterns you've been tracing. The abandonment of restraint is not a coup, it is a consensus. Hayek's warning in chapter 1 is not that planning leads immediately to tyranny, but that once restraint is abandoned, coercion no longer needs villains, only administrators. If you would like to hear more, please subscribe and leave a like. Thank you.